Welcome to the PowerBlog site, December 18th, 2014. The United States Centers for Disease Control says that 3,400 commercial United States airline passengers will end up sitting within 3 feet of an Ebola patient in the next year. Now, that's actually double what they said a month ago. In November, they said it was approximately 1,700 U.S. passengers. So in the last month, they've doubled this to say that in the next year, there will be 3,400 airline passengers in the U.S. who will be sitting within 3 feet of an active Ebola patient next year. And where this information comes from is this release that was put out from the CDC to the Office of Management and Budget on December 12th. And here's the key information out of this thing. This is because they're putting out a questionnaire and they expect people to take their time to fill it out, so they have to report it to OMB. It says the purpose of this is to assess the risk to individuals who may have been exposed to a confirmed case of Ebola while traveling to or within the United States. And so what they've done is they've made this chart here that shows the various diseases, and we get down to Ebola. And here they show that they're expecting 3,400 people in the United States to come in direct contact, be within 3 feet of an Ebola patient while flying in the air, in an airplane. And as part of that, they're expecting 50,000 additional people who were in that same airplane, or in those airplanes, but not within 3 feet of the patient. As I said, we'll get into more detail on that in a moment. So what it comes down is to a case of coffee, tea, or Ebola. Now, what makes this so very concerning is that the Centers for Disease Control are extremely poor at risk mitigation. One merely needs to look at what happened in Dallas, Texas with the nurses who came down with Ebola. They were following CDC's instructions on how to protect themselves from Ebola to the letter. Well, CDC's thought, well, American healthcare workers aren't going to get it because we're just so much better than what happens in Africa, and we know what we're doing, therefore there's less risk. Those Africans, supposedly the CDC thinks, are just dumb. That's why those healthcare workers get it. Well, that's just idiotic thinking on the CDC's part. What they should have realized is that when you go to an Ebola treatment center in Africa, very little is done to you. You basically, if you're dying, you get set aside and they give you some water. In a few cases, they might do an IV, but they don't do anything really serious or strenuous or invasive to try to save you. Whereas in the United States, if you're an Ebola patient and you go into a hospital, you get intubated, you get IVs, you get hooked up to everything. So this sprays Ebola up into air. And so the nurses basically caught Ebola from having their exposed skin hit with airborne Ebola. CDC did not foresee any of this, although it was easily foreseen. While CDC's got the same problem here with these airline passengers, they're not very concerned that there's going to be 3,400 people in the United States who are going to be exposed to Ebola. And that's because they believe Ebola is going to spread in the exact same way as it's been spreading in the warm climates of Africa. Now, they've taken no steps to mitigate that, to mitigate basically the Department of Defense's concern that winter weather may facilitate a super flu-like airborne spread of Ebola. Now, we've got some links to this, but basically the Department of Defense believes that in winter weather conditions, just like the flu, Ebola will spread readily in an airborne way. And, along those same lines, when flu spreads in equatorial Africa, it doesn't spread airborne because of the heat. That's why there's less flu in the summer, in the hot seasons. But when it turns winter, the virus survives in the air very well. And the Department of Defense sees this as the same risk with Ebola. CDC sees this as no risk. CDC believes the only risk from Ebola is if you're in close contact with a very sick person. I mean, like somebody who's so sick that they have to be taken to the hospital. CDC doesn't see any risk that, wow, if we're getting winter weather, cold weather, humidity changes, that maybe if somebody is coughing up Ebola, that they might readily spread it, and it might readily spread in a more flu-like manner. In fact, it would spread in a much worse than a flu-like manner, because not only would it spread airborne, but it would also spread contact. So that is the risk coming out of this thing. Now, one way to look at this is, if they say that there's going to be 3,400 commercial airline passengers seated within 3 feet of an Ebola patient in the next year, and here's an airline chart, a seating chart. Here's our Ebola patient. Worst case, there are 8 people within 3 feet of him. Now that assumes only contact spread, not flu-like airborne spread, which again might happen. So if you assume CDC's analysis, worst case, or the conservative case, that 8 people are at risk, that means, and let me zoom in on this here, blow it up. That means that CDC is expecting 425 actively infected Ebola patients to fly into the United States next year. Our own personal belief is the highest risk period for these entries is in the winter, New Year's time frame. Christmas through the early part of New Year's, maybe into Valentine's Day, just because that's when the most flights will be happening, and that's when flu season often comes along strongest. So we see a very significant risk of Ebola coming into the United States and spreading in an explosive manner. Now, this doesn't make it a certainty, because really what is needed for this to happen is that we have to have an infected Ebola patient, most likely somebody who was infected via the lungs first, because if you're infected via the lungs first, then you are more likely to spread Ebola prior to symptom onset. So if somebody who has an airborne infection of Ebola that first, where their primary infection site was the lungs, and that person is in a crowded environment in the winter time, then this Ebola thing could spread like wildfire, like flu on steroids. Now, whether or not that will happen, it's uncertain, but it is a definite possibility. You don't have to take our word for it. The Department of Defense, their Aerobiological Sciences Division, believes that this is the case, or that this case is possible. So be wary and be prepared.